Make sure we're going live. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the cherry on top of the last part of the semester, these stretching concepts, and then I'll open it up for any questions you guys have. So everything we do is a progression. I'm trying to see how we get this glare off of this board. I swear this classroom is so weird. It's so weird. That's okay, because I'm weird too. Let's see if that helps. All right, so last time we talked about plyometrics, the plyometric sequence, a muscle agonist, stretching, technically being stretched. A muscle can't stretch itself, right? A rubber band can't stretch itself. The muscle is being stretched while it's still trying to pull above rest, right? So it's doing a job, and then it can change direction and shorten while actually trying to shorten. Being stretched while trying to shorten, shorten while trying to shorten. So what we're doing with stretching is just kind of taking half of that concept, being lengthened, and instead of changing direction, we're going to just look at the being lengthened part. So stretching comes from kind of the stretch shortening cycle, as I talked about with plyometrics. And when a muscle is stretched, there's two types: static, where you hold a position, and dynamic, where you're just constantly moving to try to get more range of motion. Research shows that both of them are effective. Movement is life. If you don't move it or lose it, right? So in terms of what's better, any movement is good, especially for people who are sedentary, non-active. Just movement, more important than anything, movement. But if we're looking at static stretches, we're looking at position, holding a position. And if we're going to be looking at dynamics, we're going to look at constantly changing position through motion. And of course, as you have motion in one direction, you're going to be lengthening muscles that pull the other way. That's what today's lecture is about, okay? So stretching in terms of a muscle group, who are you stretching? Super simple. If you're looking at muscles that pull in the direction of hip flexion, flexion pullers, it makes sense that any flexion you have, those strings are actually going to get shorter. And any strings that pull the other way are going to get longer. So how do you stretch hip extensors? By flexing the hip. How would you stretch hip flexors? By extending the hip. Why do I teach it this way? Because there's going to be a lot of muscles that don't have their direction of pull in it. I mean, rinse, wash, repeat. Some muscles, like the adductor magnus, adductor longus, that has the direction of pull in it. So if I say, how do I stretch an adductor magnus? Great, it pulls in the direction of adduction. I need to abduct my hip. But there's other muscles, tibialis posterior, tibialis anterior, quadratus femoris, rectus femoris, that have these Latin terms in it. And their direction of pull isn't embedded in the name. So how I want to teach it to you is, I need to stretch a specific muscle. How does that muscle pull, or what group is that muscle in? The tibialis posterior is a plantar flexion puller. It's in that group. Well, if it's a plantar flexion puller, I need to dorsiflex the ankle in order to lengthen it or stretch it. Does that make sense? So it still comes back to the importance of understanding groups based off of pull. To take it a step further, the tibialis posterior at the subtalar joint is an inversion puller. So I would need an evert to lengthen that muscle. But those concepts aren't given just with the name, a muscle that's on the posterior part of the tibia. So what the muscle is by name is just name alone. What does it do is based off of its direction of pull. Once we know its direction of pull, we know how to move or position the joint to lengthen. Cool? So in terms of stretching, your position is going to dictate what is being lengthened. Okay? Your position And when I say motion, again, it's with dynamics, it's almost like plyometrics. If I'm flexing my shoulder, I'm going to be lengthening my extensors. If I'm flexing my if I'm flexing my wrist, I'm going to be lengthening my extensors. If I extend my wrist, I'm going to be lengthening my flexors. So static is typically holding a position. So I am extended. I'd be stretching muscles that pull in the direction of flexion. If I'm flexed, I'm going to be stretching muscles that pull in the direction of extension. It's literally that easy. But I want us to get into the habit of understanding the importance and the value of looking at things in terms of their direction of pull so that we can make sense of, as I internally rotate, I stretch external rotators. As I horizontally abduct, I stretch horizontal adductors. As I look to the right transversely, I stretch muscles that are pulling to my left transversely. As I bend to the right, I stretch muscles that are pulling to the left. It's that easy. But if I just said, how do I stretch a right sternocleidomastoid? Your instinct would say, well, it's on the right, so bend to the left. And you're right. You're correct. However, in the transverse plane, the right sternocleidomastoid actually pulls to the left. It's like when I got in trouble as a kid, my mom would pull my ear. If she pulls my right ear forward, wouldn't it make me want to look to the left? So we have to understand that the right sternocleidomastoid, eventually, this is 415, but it's the concept that my right pulls to the left. So how would I stretch this one? I actually need to look to the right. So by understanding that the right is a left transverse puller, I could say, how would I stretch the right sternocleidomastoid? Well, what's its purpose? What's its function? What does it do? It pulls to the left in the transverse plane. So if I have an issue with this muscle and I need to stretch it, I actually need to look to the right. Even though the muscle's on the right, I actually need to look to the right to stretch that muscle because I understand how it pulls. Make sense? So let's do some practice. Typically, these are the questions students get right on the test. It's not rocket science. That's why we save it for last. I don't want the last lecture to be the hardest stuff. I want the last lecture to kind of be the easiest stuff. Yoink, yoink, yoink. Okay. So while the computer screen comes up, how do I know which muscle groups are the agonist group that I'm stretching or being lengthened? We don't want to use just a term like hamstrings. Reason is there's other muscles, right? There's other muscles being stretched, there's other muscles being lengthened. If all you ever do is say hamstring, and in a clinical setting, you need to stretch another muscle that's a hip extensor, how do you know? The analogy that I like to use is if all you do is carry around a hammer, you better hope that every problem you ever encounter is a nail. But we have to have a tool belt of different tools because we never know what our problem's going to be and we need to be prepared for it, okay? Just like I need to be prepared. There we go. So this person would be stretching her right hip extensors because I understand that her right hip position is flexed. So as she has flexion, the flexion pullers are going to get shorter and shorter and shorter, and the extension pullers are going to get longer and longer and longer. And in 415, we're going to say, well, who are the extension pullers? And we're going to learn specifically about the semimembranosus, tendinosus, biceps femoris, long head, not both, and the gluteus maximus, and some other pullers. So this class isn't to tell you how to stretch. This class isn't to tell you ACSM recommendations. You guys have class for that. I'm a biomech. I'm just here to tell you how tension structures work and how they pull and how we can influence and see how to lengthen things based off of their pull. Shoulder rotation. Now, just because I'm respecting the shoulder doesn't mean I'm disrespecting other things. It's just we analyze motion joint by joint, we analyze muscles joint by joint, we analyze stretching joint by joint. I'm not disrespecting the wrist. I'm just saying, let's have a wrist conversation after we first talk about the shoulder. Okay? So shoulder rotation of his right. Is he externally rotated or internally rotated? Externally. So he's not going to be stretching the external rotation pullers. He'd be stretching the internal rotation pullers. So again, practically, if you're in a clinical setting and let's say you have a tight subscapularis muscle, well, what does that muscle do? I'm going to teach you that, all right, what's the muscle? Subscapularis, how does it pull? Internal rotation of the shoulder. It's an internal, you don't even know this for the test. I'm showing you how this, learning this, how I'm teaching you now is going to be helpful for our next class. Subscapularis is an internal rotation puller. It's an internal rotator. If I need to stretch it, I need to externally rotate the shoulder. If it's externally rotated, it's going to stretch the internal rotation pullers. And there's other muscles involved. But what I'm trying to get my students out of the habit of is saying this stretch only does this muscle because there's other muscles involved. So talk about the stretch in a group concept. You're stretching all the muscles that pull in that direction of motion. And one of your favorites might be in that group, but it's not the only one. Coco concept. If we stop talking about it or thinking about it, it disappears, it vanishes. All right, what about the wrist? Would I be stretching the flexors or the extensors? Not that this is a wrist stretch, we're just practicing. My flexion pullers and my extension pullers. That is correct, shy people. It is the flexion pullers because my wrist is extended. Cool. Now again, I'm not saying this is a wrist stretch. We're just wild pictures here for analyzing. Let's do ankle, specifically right ankle. And again, what I like about this example is it helps us practice differentiation of verbiage. Knee to wall, dorsiflexion ankle test. Dorsiflexion is a motion. Okay? So we have the motion of dorsiflexion. So what would be stretched? Not dorsiflexors, plantar flexors. As you dorsiflex, you're going to lengthen what pulls in the opposite direction. And another cool thing about biomechanics is we're going to look at muscles that cross multiple joints and how if you put something on slack on one end, you can emphasize things that aren't on slack on the other. But we kind of have to set the ground rules first before we get into some of those, the next chapter. Okay? What group would I be stretching or lengthening? He's pulling in a direction of dorsiflexion. So as the dorsiflexion happens, I'm going to lengthen the muscles at plantar flex. Stretching flexors or extensors? Flexors. Like guys, it's literally that easy. What's my position? Guys, we have been practicing position for months, and I'm hoping this is where it can, one of the many reasons it could pay off. What is my position? And what do I know of muscles in terms of how they work, they pull? So I'm extended, so therefore I'm stretching flexors. If I wanted to stretch extensors, I would need to flex. Is that simple? Here we go. Stretching those extensors because I see that he's in a flex position. Now, if you struggle with position, I could see how you may struggle with stretching, but we've done it so much and we practice so much, I'm hoping that that's not a limiting factor. But if you don't know the difference between internal and external rotation, Yeah, this may be difficult, but if you know what we've been practicing for months, this should be super simple. Let's have a conversation about ankle and knees. What's the position of the ankle joints? Are they plantar or dorsiflexed? Plantar. So would I be stretching plantar flexion pullers or dorsiflexion pullers? This hurts me just looking at it, man. Knees, am I stretching flexors or extensors? Extensors. It's that easy. And so eventually how we're going to apply this, by practicing this verbiage, by me testing you on this verbiage, when we do get to specific muscles that have no direction of pull in their name, you're going to be like, okay, the vastus medialis is a knee extensor. So therefore, I know if I need to stretch it, I need to flex my knees. The rectus femoris is a hip flexor, knee extensor. So if I'm trying to stretch it, I need to extend my hip and flex my knees. The gastrocnemius is a knee flexor, ankle plantar flexor. So if I want to really stretch it, I want to make sure my knee is extended and I dorsiflex my ankle. Direction of pull is the most important thing to understand about how muscles work. Let's get to the trunk. What's her position? Let's go transverse. What's her position? Is she twisted to the right or to the left? Remember, her right or her left? She's twisted to her left. Good. So if she's twisted to her left, she would be stretching muscles that are pulling to the right. She'd be stretching right transverse trunk rotators or right transverse trunk rotation pullers. Who are those muscles? Right now, I don't care. But I'm going to eventually teach you the muscles that pull to the right are the left external, right internal, and right erector spinae. We're going to learn those things. But we have to get into the habit of muscles function by pulling. And the most important thing to understand is their direction of pull. And again, I'm not disrespecting other joint positions. I'm just choosing to have a conversation about the trunk. We could have a conversation about any joint. But this was the most obvious. All right, let's do a tricky one. Give that some thought. Let's see if I can rotate the screen to show. So everybody at home, you can zoom in. I apologize for the screen being bleh. Screen is bleh. All right. All right. How is the trunk twisted? To his right or to his left? Is his sternum looking at his right hip or his left hip? Good. That's a clues. That is the clues. So if his trunk is twisted to his right, we have to be stretching muscles that are pulling to the left. We're stretching the left transverse trunk rotators or the left transverse trunk rotation pullers. And what are those muscles? Who cares? You just know you have muscles that pull in every direction of motion. And in biomechanics, I'm going to teach you about the right external, the left internal, and the left erector. Spinalis, iliocastalis, longissimus. But all of those names, Tom, Joey, Sally, Bobby, it's just names. Direction of pull. How do they pull? Okay, what about this stretch? Just okay, any questions? Like I said, guys, if you have been studying, and I know those of you that are here in class have been. But if you understand position, where is that joint at, then you should want me to ask 30 stretch questions. You know, if I'm flexed, I'm stretching extensors. If I'm bent to the right, I'm stretching left lateral benders. If I'm bent to the left, I'm stretching right lateral benders. If I'm extended, I'm stretching flexors. Like, it's literally that simple. But we have to know position. Any questions? Okay, then I will open it up to general test questions. Keep in mind, I have no idea what I'm asking because I haven't, well, no, let me rephrase that. I know the topics that I can ask. I know the kind of questions I can ask. It's what we've been doing for the past Unit 4 things. I just don't know exactly what I will ask. So a question like, will you ask this? I'm going to be like, but I can answer, can I ask it? Does that make sense? Can you ask a question like this? And I might say yes, or I might say no. Make sense? Will I? Can I? What's that Drake meme? Will I? Can I? Is that still a thing? I'm years behind pop culture. My boys try to catch me up, but I can't. I'm too slow. Anybody have any exam questions?
Okay. Does the plyometric sequence always follow an eccentric?
It has to, absolutely. It has to start with eccentric braking, followed by concentric gassing, speeding up. It has to, because that's the only thing that structures that pull can be responsible for back-to-back. The analogy I give in classes, once I shorten, while trying to shorten, I can't push it to a stop. But if it's moving away from me, I can slow it down while it's moving away, change its direction, and speed it up while it's moving too. But remember, it's not just the entire eccentric phase followed by the entire concentric phase. That's not what plyometrics is. It's specifically that change in direction. It's specifically when the eccentric is going to put on the brake of motion one way, followed by the gas of motion the other. It's almost summertime, yeah. Anybody taking 415 this summer in July? I prefer face-to-face anyway, so.
I have another question.
Come on.
Can you go?
You could have all the questions.
With the, yeah, I was studying last night.
That's awesome.
Can you go over the example with the windshield exercise, like the landing floor?
Mm-hmm. So this would be trying to identify the agonist, correct? Okay. I think I told you guys, if I ask a windshield exercise, it would be isometric because the windshield with pelvic rotation being opposite of trunk rotation, that's confusing. And we're going to develop those concepts in biomechanics. So on the test, it would be more of a help me identify what motion or what agonist at the trunk. Now, keep in mind, the pelvic girdle is not a joint. Elbow's a joint, wrist is a joint, trunk is a joint. The pelvic girdle is like a basketball, and the basketball can spin, but it can't spin itself, right? We have to spin it. If it's in our hands below, that's representative of our hips, or above, that's represented with our trunk. So even though we can talk about pelvic girdle position, pelvic girdle motion, when we come to agonist muscles, we have to identify, well, what was responsible for spinning the basketball? So the muscles are either going to be hip muscles or, in this case, trunk muscles. Okay. An example that I think you guys can probably better understand practically is my hip extensors are allowing my anterior pelvic girdle rotation through eccentric, and my hip extensors are causing the posterior pelvic girdle rotation through concentric. The hip extensors are allowing the flexion of my hips. The hip extensors are making the extension of the hips. It still comes down to my hip muscles moving my pelvis. In this case, it's trunk muscles. Gravity is trying to do what to the pelvis? Spin it to the left. So that tells me gravity has to be trying to spin the trunk to the right. Gravity is trying to make this person's sternum look more at his right hip. Does that make sense? Any questions on why gravity is trying to twist his trunk to the right? Pelvis to the left, but trunk to the right, cap and bottom. So far, so bad? If gravity is trying to twist his trunk to the right, I don't need right transverse trunk twisters. I don't need muscles that are also trying to twist his trunk to the right, especially if I'm just trying to hold this position. If all of a sudden he turned off all of his muscles, boom. And especially if all of a sudden he turned on muscles that are pulling to the right, bang, he would slam his feet into the ground. So if gravity is trying to twist his trunk to his right, I need muscles that are trying to twist his trunk to the left. Make sense? I'm trying to teach my students to see who you need because you see why you need them. I'm trying to teach my students to not play fast and loose with core because it is tricky. And I can see how so many people would just be like, I'm stretching stuff in here. And you're not wrong, but we need to know, who are we stretching? Who are we working? Because sometimes you need to emphasize certain muscles, and sometimes you need to not emphasize certain muscles. That's called indication or contraindication. So for our jobs, eventually, most of you, there's going to be a time and place where I need to not innervate certain muscles, or I need to emphasize certain muscles. And we have to know how to set these things up or see these things so that we're not working muscles we shouldn't, or not working muscles we should. Was that more clear?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. And I want to emphasize too, all of my lectures are streamed. So at any time, you can go back and rewatch certain parts where I explain some of these concepts. That's just cherry on top. Just, if you're studying this weekend and you're like, I'm not quite sure about X, Y, or Z, then just go back and rewatch the part where I explain X, Y, and Z. But we have 20 more minutes where I can explain X, Y, and Z in class. What you got, Chance?
I'm just making sure. So for that question, we just be identifying the muscles that are being used.
If the question is, what would be my agonist, which means muscles doing a job, right? Working above resting tone to do a job. What would be my agonist at the trunk to maintain this position? It would be left transverse trunk rotator. Because gravity is trying to twist my trunk to its right. It's really the same concept as all the other stuff. It's just a little tricky with trunk and pelvis moving in opposite directions. That's all. But it's the same concept. Gravity's trying to do this. Gravity's trying to do this. I need muscles that are trying to do that. Gravity's trying to do this. I need muscles that are trying to do that. What is that? Those trunk muscles are trying to twist my pelvis to the right, but thus trying to twist my trunk to the left. left transverse trunk rotation pullers, left transverse trunk rotators. But that's why for 310, I leave out the legs go down, the legs come up. I leave out the concentric, eccentric, because I think that would just be too much. Not that some of you couldn't do it, but I think that would be a little too much. I'm just trying to see if you could identify the isometric, because I think that's something we should be able to do for the pelvic vertebral rotation. We'll do the concentric, eccentric for all the other more simple or the easier to see motions. And guys, I know what's going to happen, and I guess I'm setting myself up for failure, but you're going to memorize. You're going to try to memorize, and that's understandable. But what I'm asking you to do is try to see it. Try to see it. Try to say, gravity's trying to do this. What's that at the trunk? I don't need muscles that are doing that at the trunk. I need muscles that are trying to do this at the trunk. By practicing to see it, it's only going to help you in biomechanics. It's only going to help you in your clinical setting. It's only going to help you in life. Anything else? Unit 4 is all on Moodle. I even have some old lectures on there. So remember, all of this semester lectures are on my YouTube channel, and they're dated. And I try to label them Unit 4, this date. So there's a progression. There's a natural dated progression. Old lectures are on Moodle if you just want to hear it in a different way. Same stuff, but maybe I use different analogies that semester. That's available too. Miriam and Sydney may or may not, they have finals too, be available for help. But just
Study session Sunday, I believe.
sweet, awesome. I don't want any part. I don't want any part of it, because not that I don't want to help, but I don't want to answer questions that they may have given. I mean, I wasn't there. I didn't, So in other words, in the past, too many times students come to me, usually the night before the test, and hey, at the review, this, what's going on with this, and I'm like, trying to write your test. So just make sure you understand that if you have a follow-up question, follow it up with them. And if they have a question about that, follow it up, they'll come to me. Don't come to me with a question that they gave you. That's my only rule. Okay? And that was Sunday? Sunday?
Yes.
Good deal. All right, guys, we're good? Let's do this. Wasting away again in my